Hi and welcome, I'm AnewZ and you are watching Context. Azerbaijan is gearing up to host the Economic Cooperation Organization's summit in Khankendi in the run-up to ECO's 17th summit that will gather leaders and delegates from 10 countries of West, Central and South Asia as well as the Caucasus. The ECO week has kicked off. Several forums on youth engagement, gender inclusion and economic connectivity are to be held in multiple cities. ECO's Secretary General announced that the organization's Clean Energy Center will be officially launched, among other things. On what can be expected of the summit, we're talking with former UK Ambassador James Sharp, coming to us from London. Welcome, thank you so much for joining us. First off, you were posted in a few ECO countries. How much would you say that the connectivity and cooperation within the ECO region has grown over the years?
Yes, it's true. I've served in at least 3 of the ECO countries: Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And I think what's interesting about the ECO. It's a long-standing organisation. And it's in some ways it's a collection of countries which don't have a lot in common normally. They normally belong to different groupings. So I think that ECO is relevant and important because it does bring together countries which might not otherwise talk to each other, sit down and talk to each other, negotiate and discuss developmental issues left by themselves, because they tend to belong to different blocks, if you like. So having this summit, I think, is important, really, just for that, because a lot has changed since 2023. I think the last summit was in 2023 in Tashkent, and a lot has changed, obviously, in the region since then. Not only Taliban have consolidated their power, but also American policy has changed significantly. We've just seen Iran-Israel conflict, for example. Pakistan, India have had a conflict. So a lot has changed, and including, of course, positive changes. Azerbaijan hosted the COP29 summit just last year. So I was very pleased actually to see that some of the wraparound events you were talking about, business forum, women's forum and a youth forum. I think the latter two have a focus on sustainable development and climate change. So I think that's really important to bed that type of thinking into the discussions that ECO countries have. What does the future hold for the region, individually and collectively? In terms of connectivity, yes, very much. There's much greater focus in the last few years on connectivity in the region. It came about, I think, from a sense of, we need to think about other ways to connect China to Europe, given what happened in Russia, given the distaste that European companies and countries have in terms of shipping goods via Russia, and also in terms of the Red Sea problems with the Houthis firing on commercial shipping. So there was a big push and a big rise in the interest in the West and China, and how do you then develop connectivity between China and Europe. So to a certain extent, the genesis, the birth of that didn't come from the countries of the region. It was more about how do you then just connect using those countries, if you like, rather than for them themselves. But what's been very interesting over the last year or so has been the recognition, the realization that actually it's the countries of the region that do stand to benefit most from increased connectivity. So we've seen a lot more focus on connectivity of different types. Obviously the middle corridor and rail connectivity has been a big thing, if you like, but also looking at green energy, digital connectivity, aviation connectivity, for example, have also been sort of big changes in the last couple of years.
You've touched upon the North Corridor not being so attractive anymore because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Middle Corridor has stepped in. Of course, there's also the proposed North-South Corridor, all within the ECO region. Do you see the summit looking to expand that trade cooperation and maybe boost capacities?
Well, I hope so. The ECO is, as I said, is an interesting body, which you could say is something like ASEAN, for example, in terms of cooperation to promote both economic development, but also, I think, other things as well, cultural links and what have you. I don't, because of the different makeup of the different countries, I don't think it's quite got to the stage of ASEAN. But it's certainly, as I say, it's an opportunity for the countries to really sit down without the outside powers, without Europe on one hand, without China on the other hand, and actually work out for themselves, what works for themselves. I think that's the important point about it. Really, is it just gives them that opportunity to think about it in terms of just what are their interests, and not be guided necessarily by the interest of the countries to the west or countries to the east.
Well, as you've said, different countries with very different views on some things. You've mentioned earlier, Iran just got out of a 12-day war with Israel, the Pakistani brief armed conflict with India. Do you expect these to be addressed at all?
I think not directly. What I would say is that all of the countries will be conscious that there are some countries in the organisation which have economic sanctions imposed on them. I mean, Iran, of course, is one of those, and Afghanistan is another country which has sanctions and which has very, very difficult relationships with the West. So that will, I suspect, if I'm perfectly honest, limit some of the opportunities that the organisation has to develop fully fledged economic cooperation between the countries, because certain countries will be very wary about the risk of secondary sanctions, for example. But having said that, I do think that there are more opportunities for the countries to get together and benefit from each other. As I say, there's a sense of, if you look at countries like Azerbaijan, you think about the Caucasus, you look at Central Asian countries, you think about China, you think about Russia, you think about the West. But I think that to think about the broader perspectives that these countries have, and actually sit down and actually talk about that. What do we want as regional countries? What do we want from this summit? And I think that's the important point there. Really, is it's their opportunities to kind of strike their own deals, if you like. So very, very important, I think, and very significant to that extent.
There are a lot of other geopolitical developments we've touched upon. Some of them: change of power in Afghanistan, in Syria, Russia-Ukraine war, and so on. Do you see the ECO or any subset of it taking on more geopolitical significance in these circumstances?
Well, I think the geopolitics is actually very interesting. We look at these countries in Central Asia, for example, just to take them as an example, and there's always been a sense of, they've got Russia to the north and China to the east, and the West would like to do more with them, but it's just quite difficult given the geographical location. And the whole point about the middle corridor, as I say, it was looking at how do you then ship things from China to the West, but then it became much broader, which is how do you then use it to support the economic development of those countries, but also how do you give them opportunities to engage with other countries, particularly the West or to the South, for example. So that's really, I think, the whole, as I say, the Northern Corridor issue, the Russia question, then sparked off this discussion and debate about actually what works for those countries. So this then coincided, of course, with the whole focus on critical minerals and China's monopolization of the production and processing of critical minerals. And we've seen recently how they've actually turned off the taps. They've sort of imposed export controls on some rare earths for export to American companies, for example. So there's a much greater focus now on, where do we get critical minerals from? And Kazakhstan in particular and other countries in the region, I do think, offer those opportunities. So the link between the middle corridor, the new rail link, and the critical minerals question, I think, has really sparked much wider interest in the role that these countries can play. So it's sparked interest in the geopolitics of it all as well, the extent to which actually what happens, we have a middle corridor, we improve the infrastructure, who will that benefit? We hope it will benefit Western companies and Western governments able to then access critical minerals, able to access the other materials that are produced and processed in these countries. And we hope as a result of that will then benefit the countries of the region. But equally, you could argue that actually all of this infrastructure an exploration for critical minerals will actually benefit China even more. So I think all of that still has to play out. And linked to that, I've talked about the East-West corridor quite a lot. Of course, the countries of the region, particularly the southern half of the Economic Cooperation Organization region, they're just as focused on the North-South corridor. How do they get access to the Indian Ocean, whether that be through Iran or through Pakistan, or even through India, for example. So I think that it's becoming very, very interesting. And you've got this whole much, much broader geopolitical question out there, which I've written about previously, which is something called the heartland theory. or the rise of Eurasia, and the extent to which, if you control Eurasia, then you control the world. And there's kind of quite a lot of academic discussion about this in sort of the early part of last century and mid part of last century. But the heartland theory was all about if you control Eurasia. And at that time, the person talking about it saw the rise of railway lines, if you like, linking, going from Germany all the way across Russia to the Pacific, and suddenly feeling that actually it was the use of railways through the heartland of Eurasia, which was then going to be more important than control of the sea lanes. Now, that's very disputable. However, it is out there, that whole question about if you have the rise of authoritarianism in Eurasia. Russia we know about, and its aggressive policy towards Ukraine, and actually towards Azerbaijan nowadays as well, but also the rise of China and what that means for the West, if you like. So I do think that there's a much greater focus on the geopolitics of Eurasia nowadays. And as I said, a lot of this goes back about a century or so when this was being talked about then. And it's now come back up again. So very interesting times. And I think that it'll become, the focus on this part of the world will become more and more acute over the coming years. And the extent to which the ECO can play a role in that, time will tell. I mean, I think still individual states are very important, but the ECO hopefully will have something of a role in providing something of a unified view, which takes a regional view, if you like, outside the purview of the sort of great powers.
As the world is witnessing unprecedented heat waves right now, one of the things mentioned ahead of the summit is collaboration on climate resilience. You of course mentioned Azerbaijan hosting the UN's climate conference. Just a few days ago, Afghanistan was hit by deadly flash floods. How much can a regional approach to tackling the issue be more efficient than going at it alone?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't have a clear answer to that one. I think that when these natural disasters strike, then most countries around the world, and not just in that region, but we see that in Western Europe as well, is that asking for support from neighbouring countries is standard practice. So even in where there have been fires, wildfires in southern Europe, for example, then they've got support from all around Europe. When there's been earthquakes in Turkey, for example, then they've got support from many European countries, many other countries around the world. So I think those structures and those systems tend to be in place already. I don't know whether the ECO is planning on setting up some sort of regional kind of monitoring or kind of hazard preparedness centre. But yes, I think that there's always scope to look at that and move away from pure economic development, because the world is changing, so the environment is changing, if you like. So I think being aware of that and thinking about what can we do together. And I think we've seen some of that. Obviously, that kind of cooperation on natural environment issues in terms of transboundary river questions, which obviously Central Asia with the Sirdar and AnewZ have a lot of experience in dealing with transboundary river issues. Azerbaijan, I know, the main rivers in Azerbaijan do come from Georgia and Turkey, for example. So I think that's tried and tested. And I feel, yes, that the way the climate change is going, there are benefits to more regional cooperation. I think that talking about transboundary issues, transboundary water issue, of course, one of the big issues that the Central Asians now worried about is that Afghanistan is building a canal to take off water for irrigation, and the extent to which that impacts upon particularly Uzbekistan. I think Turkmenistan is going to be quite a vexed issue, which hopefully this regional structure will provide something of an opportunity to address that.
In that same vein of the climate change, a quicker transition to renewables is also in the works. ECO's Clean Energy Center is expected to officially launch this week. We know earlier about the undersea cable project meant to deliver green energy from South Caucasus to Europe. What kind of a potential do you see in these countries to go green, not only for domestic needs, but also to export?
I think that there's a lot of potential, because these countries, by and large, are not heavily populated. There's actually quite a lot of empty space, and some of the countries have proven offshore wind or onshore wind opportunities, and of course a lot of solar opportunities. So I do think there's a potential there. The question is whether it becomes cost effective to do it. Because if you're going to import or build wind turbines or solar panels, you're going to install them and what have you, and then you've got to export the electricity somewhere, you then have to factor in the costs of that because it's quite a long way to larger markets. As I say, most of the countries of that region, certainly Central Asia, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, don't have huge populations. Pakistan, of course, does. Iran does. And Turkey does as well, of course. So yeah, I think it will depend on the circumstances, to be honest. But yes, in principle, of course. I mean, when I talk about the economics of it all, one of the issues that countries like Kazakhstan have, for example, is that they have huge coal reserves. So for them, it's got to be a question of, well, does it become economically sensible to build lots of renewable power? Will that compete in terms of price with coal power, for example? At some stage, the countries have then got to sort of balance that cost equation with the point about climate change and the fact that coal in particular is a major contributor to climate change. So it's not just a question of do they have the opportunities for renewable power? Answer yes. It then comes down to both the economics and then also the commitment to reduce carbon emissions. And certainly for COP30, I know that all countries are being asked to come up with a new what's called a nationally determined contribution, which means a new target for reducing carbon emissions. So certainly the world will be looking to all of the countries of this region to come up with very stretching targets for reducing carbon emissions, while recognising, of course, the some of them are not major carbon emitters, like Tajikistan, for example, and Turkmenistan's a big gas emitter, of course. But so I think it's as with everything to do with economics and climate change and development, there's a lot of complexity as to what seems quite simple in the first place.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and providing us with your insight.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That's all we had for you in this edition of Context. Stay tuned to AnewZ.